Let's talk about seller concessions. That's another way of saying how do you roll in closing costs on a purchase loan. So technically, you can't roll in costs when buying a home. That's a refinance term. But seller concessions is a way to make it so that the buyer doesn't necessarily need to pay for the closing costs, or at least not all of them. So let's talk about what seller concessions are. Seller concessions are where the seller is giving concessions or conceding money to a buyer. Important thing to note, that money cannot pay for the down payment. It can pay for pretty much any and all other costs. It can pay for closing costs and prepaids and HOA dues and points and anything else you want to put in there, but it cannot pay for the down payment. So how does it work? It works with, let's use an example of a $400,000 purchase price. Buyer and seller both agree. Handshake, 400 grand. Cool. Buyer says, you know what? I actually would love it if I didn't have to pay 5 grand to closing cost. Mr. Seller, can you pay for 5 grand? Well, Mr. Seller's going to say, well, sure, but you're going to buy the house from me now for 405 because we just agreed on 400,000. So now for 405,000, I don't mind taking that extra 5 grand of proceeds I'd get and give it over to your side so that you don't have to bring 5 grand to closing cost. And that's what seller concessions are. So sellers shouldn't care whether you have them or not, don't have them, because at the end of the day, they don't make any more or less by having those concessions. So they shouldn't care one way or the other. For the buyer, somebody might say, well, doesn't that mean my loan amount's going to be bigger and so my payment's bigger? Okay, let's say the buyer in this example is putting down 5%. That's $20,000 on the 400 grand purchase price, 5% of 400 grand. If now he's going to buy it for 405, we've now increased the down payments by $250 total. So instead of 20,000, now it's 20, comma 250. The difference in payment, if it's $5, right? Depends on rate and all that stuff, but it's not even $5 a month. So for me, I will tell you, generically speaking, and there's a whole, hierarchy of, and we'll put a link somewhere around here for this, of how I believe you should pay for closing costs and when you should pay for it. But ultimately, as a general rule of thumb, I'm on board with anybody keeping 5 grand in their bank account in exchange for just a few bucks a month in the monthly payment. Cash is king, especially when moving with all the cost. So that's what seller concessions are. They do vary by program. There's a chart we'll put somewhere down here that just shows, but just to say it verbally real quick, conventional loans can range anywhere from 3% to 9%. The difference is how much you put down and the occupancy type. So if you put down 5%, or I guess technically less than 10%, you're limited to 3% total. And that means of the purchase price. So in my example, 405, it's going to be a little over 12 grand, whatever that number ends up working out to be. So it's about a little over 12 grand for 3% of that purchase price. If they put down 10% or more, up to 24.99%, then you're going to get 6% seller concessions. And if you put down 25% or more, it's 9%. If it's an investment property on conventional financing, and conventional means Fannie Freddie, right? The normal air quotes, plain vanilla stuff, it's 2%. FHA, USDA, 6, VA, air quotes unlimited, but really a lot of lenders are going to say like 4%. So use the 4%, but that's the overviews of what they are. And again, I'll put a chart down below so you don't have to remember all that. So now what is the risk? The risk is one, if there's too much concessions. So let's use our example of the 405 with the 5 grand. Let's say Joe Buyer only needs 4 grand at closing. Well, if they only need 4 and they're getting 5, and remember, they can't pay for the down payment. The seller concessions can't go towards down payment. That means we need to go back before closing and just amend it real quick and easy. Say, hey, instead of 405, let's buy it for 404 and reduce the concessions from 5 grand to 4 grand. That way the seller doesn't make the extra $1,000 and we only pay for what we need. So the reason why I say negotiate as much as you can up front is we can go amend that later on. We can change that number down. So the risk, air quotes, the risk of getting too much is just one extra piece of initials for both people, right? To write up in a quick amendment, says 405 goes to 404, 5 grand goes to 4 grand. It's literally initials, and we're done. So that's one quote unquote risk. I don't see that as a real risk, but I'm throwing it out there. The second one is a risk in that, let's say 405 in this example, and the appraisal comes back at 403,000. Well, if that's the case, the sellers are probably going to say like, hey, sorry, it's 403, but I'm not giving you the same 5 grand if now you only want to buy for 403. So what they'll do is they'll probably just say, hey, I'll sell you the house now at 403 with 3 grand concessions. And so the risk is you could be expecting as a buyer, you expect 5 grand is going to get paid for, but if the appraisal hits 403, which is more than the original ask price of 400, but less than you raising the price to accommodate these concessions. So now halfway through 2 weeks to close, 3 weeks to close, all of a sudden you think you got 5 grand paid for, but the appraisal comes in at 403, and now you only have 3 grand to pay for. So you got to come up with that extra two. So that's the risk, is just having this like, oh, life is good, sunshine and rainbows, only to have the amount come in lower. So just keep that in mind. That is the biggest risk. And again, as I mentioned, it's best, in my opinion, to get as much as you can in the negotiations. Don't worry about the limits. Like if you say, man, I only get 3%, negotiate as much as you can. Because once you have it, you can connect with us. We'll go through all the options, talk about what to do with the money. And if there's money left over, we'll just reduce the sales price and fix and get that fixed. So at the end of the day, it's not seller concessions should be used almost always, or at least try to be negotiated. Now, you may say, oh, I don't want to complicate it. That's fine. That's up to you. But if you want to keep the money in your bank account and in your pocket, absolutely would just say negotiate seller concessions. Check out the chart below. And as always, if you need help, reach out to the Mortgage Mark team. We are certainly here to help, because when you think mortgage, think Mark.